Welcome to this very special seminar, a webinar rather. Our focus here was actually to be with our own group members because it's a process of learning. There are younger people coming into this movement, and we thought that along with the younger group, we ourselves would once again educate ourselves as to what is the Kairos movement in Palestine. And the title that we've got for today is Understanding Palestine, the Kairos Document, and the Global Kairos Movement. So the term Kairos is very significant. Most of us are familiar with this term, but every chronos of our times gives rise to a Kairos, an opportune time, a time to act, and a time that would, if we act, then something decisive will happen. If we let that time pass by, then we would regret it. And to enable us to understand our friend Yousef Alkhouri, and we are very grateful to him for giving us his time. He is a Christian Arab Palestinian. Now that is an important term because for many of us in India, Palestinians means Muslims, and we start developing a theology on those lines. So here is a significant person, a Christian Arab Palestinian. He was born in Gaza to a Christian family that has a long heritage of serving in the priesthood of the Greek Orthodox Church in Palestine. He is a lecturer of biblical studies at Bethlehem Bible College, where he earned his first degree in biblical studies and Christian education. He also holds a Master's of Divinity from Alliance Theological Seminary, New York. He's currently pursuing his PhD in contextual biblical interpretation at Vrije University of Amsterdam. Yousef is a member of Christ at the Checkpoint Young Adults. He's also a member of Global Kairos for Justice and the Academic Alliance for Interfaith Dialogue in Palestine. He has also contributed to 2 books. One is Majority World Theologies, and the other one is Refugee Diaspora. In addition to these 2 contributions, he has written several articles in Arabic and in English. Yousef is passionate about contextual theologies, holistic missions, peacemaking, and advocacy. He is married to Myrna, and they live in Bethlehem, Palestine. So, dear friend Yousef, welcome to this webinar of IPSN, Indo-Palestine Solidarity Network, and it's over to you to share with us your understanding of Palestine, the Kairos document, and the global Kairos movement. Welcome.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Ranjan, for inviting me. It's an honor to be today with you and sharing with you the story of Palestinian people, and in particular, Palestinian Christians and the movement of Kairos that has been overshadowed by many of the political issues and the military struggle under occupation of Palestinians. But today, it's representing people and speaking for the Palestinian people. And nowadays, we have these opportunities to share our story with you. I cherish this opportunity because I believe when I'm talking to people from all around the world who are interested in learning more about the Palestinian struggle for peace and justice, but also in particular when it comes to the people of India who suffered of colonialism and a class system that has been there for long time. And I think these are struggles that we share together. And I would like to present the history of Palestine from that point of view. I would love to see what is in common between us as a people, our stories of struggle as Palestinians, as Indians, as of course also South African, and many people around the globe. Allow me to share my presentation with you, and I hope you could be able to, I will send it later maybe to Brother Ranjan in order to share it with you as well. So Kairos, Palestine, in order to understand the Palestinian context, I believe it's imperative to go through the Palestinian history. And if we are talking about the Palestinian history, we need to be reminded that Palestine has been always occupied since the Assyrian Empire around 722 BC until today. Started with the Assyrian, then Babylonians, Greek, Romans, the Muslims, and then the Crusaders, the Muslims again, the Ottomans, the British, and then the Israeli occupation. So this land didn't have a chance to rest because it was a crossroads for many nations and many empires who subdued this land and its people. Therefore, I see the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian land and of the Palestinian is an extension of the European colonial or neo-colonial history. Just to remind you again that I see the Israeli occupation of Palestine as an extension of the European colonial history, which is we share a lot with it. We suffered of the British colonialism in Palestine, and in India you had this similar experience of living under colonial British imperial occupation. So the European colonial interest in Palestine in particular was driven by several factors in my observation and reading of the history of my country. First, it's the desire for expansion. As we know, the British Empire wanted to be the empire that is expanding to the whole world. And I remember they used to say that the British Empire is the empire that the sun didn't doesn't the sun down doesn't go to the British Empire because it extends to the ends of the earth. A second thing is the fear of Islam, which is very important, I think, with the rise of Islamophobia in the West until today. But also it was very significant in the colonial history of the British Empire and the European Empire in general. Third, the urgency to evangelize. And I think it's notable that many of the evangelical Western had the burden of sharing the gospel, or the white man burden, as some theologians would call it, to evangelize people, to Christianize people without respecting, without understanding of the people that they try to evangelize. And the fourth and last is apocalyptic vision, or I would rather call it fantasy, that Jews and Israel re-establishment, and here in quotation mark, would bring the second coming of Jesus Christ faster. So we could talk about how the European Orientalists misrepresented the people of the Orient, the East, including Palestinians, including Indian, including people from different Asian countries and African countries, that we were represented by the European colonial Orientalists as people who are illiterate, barbaric, unable to govern themselves. Hence, they need the European white man's savior to civilize and evangelize them. why this is very important for me to start with. I'm just trying to unpack the mentality behind the colonialism of Palestine, because such misrepresentation of the people led to dehumanizing them, demonizing even those people in order to justify the systematic oppression of colonizer. What I mean by that, we could see it practically throughout the history of Palestine when some Christians in the British Empire started having these ideas about the importance of colonizing Palestine in order to pave the way for the Jews to return. And in fact, the whole idea of the Jewish return to Palestine, and I'm very careful when I'm using return, it's the word that the British theologians or Western theologians use most of the time. And I think it's very confusing because what it means to return, even for those people who actually grew up, lived for centuries in Europe. But taking this point as those theologians and Bible scholars would say, politicians as well, the return of the Jews of Palestine actually predates the Christian interest in the Jews returning to Palestine predates the Jewish Zionist movement. And we could see that someone like Lord Shaftesbury is a Christian British who was interested in ministry among the Jews, who said that there is a country without a nation. He means here Palestine. And God now, in his wisdom and mercy, directs us to a nation without a country. What Shaftesbury is doing here, he disregards the presence of the Palestinian people in order to justify the importation of other group of people to a land under the colonial power of Britain. And as you could see on the screen, that Shaftesbury said that in 1854. So it didn't actually happen when the British colonized Palestine in the 1916-17, but it has roots in the British church, in the British theology, in the British colonial mentality to occupy Palestine in order to pave the way for Zionism and Jewish Zionism. And explicitly, the same phrase that Lord Shaftesbury, or the statement Lord Shaftesbury stated, was taken by Jewish Zionists later as the slogan for the Zionist movement in 1897. When he says, Israel Zangwill, one of the leaders of the Zionist movement, said that there is a land without people for a people without land. Could see that this idea or this mentality of the colonizers, of the Orientalists, doesn't see the people of the East, including Palestine, as if we never existed, as we are people who are barbaric, which strips away from us as people of the East and as Palestinians our humanity and our right for self-determination, which is completely ignored and unrecognized by the British theologians, British Empire, and later the Zionist movement. And here I'm reminded of Reverend Mitri Rahib, a statement about how religion and colonialism, or even politics, is a dangerous mix. And we could see, obviously, it's happening, it's still happening since then, between Christian theology and the political interest, political colonial interest in Palestine, and more problematic when religion comes to justify colonialism and oppression. And here in particular in Palestine, we could see that people at some point had faced crisis because of the occupation, because how the Bible that used to be a source of comfort for Palestinians became the sword on their necks by the colonization of the British and later the Israeli. So the colonial project of Israel in Palestine, of course, of the Zionist movement as well as the British, was motivated religiously by church and parachurch leaders such as Shaftesbury. But of course, the background of such a discourse in the West came about from certain biblical interpretation, which focuses on Israel, focuses on the end times, focuses, I would say, even on the Jewish people. I would say that theology, which divides history, which is known as dispensationalism, to 7 dispensations, 7 times of history that God deals with his people. We see that the church has only one part of that history. It seems that the church is parenthesis to Israel, which makes this Christian Zionist mentality, or Christian who thought of the centerness of the Jewish people, is Israel-centered interpretation of the Bible in order to justify, in order to rationalize the colonial project and agenda. Obviously, literalist reading and interpretation of few texts and prophecies in the Bible led to Christians and Western theologians to conclude that there is an apocalyptic significance of the Jews settling in Palestine. And I'm reminded also that many of Christian who read the Bible literally believe that Israel in the Bible is the same as Israel today. There is a huge confusion between a colonial entity like Israel today and Israel of the Old Testament. And when we talk about Zion, the whole idea which is mixed up with Zionism as actually started as a non-religious movement in the late 19th century. So all of that brings us up to the collapse of the British Empire, the Ottoman empires, sorry, the Ottoman Empire in 1916 after World War I, British colonization of Palestine, and the next year, what the British do? Give a promise to the Zionist movement, the Jewish Zionist movement, to give them a homeland in Palestine with a complete disregard to Palestinians' rights for self-determination. And here is a letter that was written by the British Foreign Secretary Lord Arthur Balfour to the Zionist movement and to the leaders of the Zionist movement. And I quote here, for in Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. And this is what's actually part of what's became to be known as the promise of Balfour, or Balfour Declaration, that was given by the British Foreign Minister to the Zionist movement, promising them a homeland in Palestine. But it's very clearly that in his mind, in his agenda, which is motivated by his also religious background as Christian in Britain back then, that the Palestinian people, although he recognized there is present inhabitants of the country, but he doesn't see any purpose or any importance to consult them about something that really matters for their livelihood. And for so long, people say that this land was without a people, so it was given to a people without land. But actually, in the same statement that disregards the Palestinians, there is a recognition of the presence of Palestinians and the historical presence of Palestinians in this land. And you could see it very clearly that he recognizes there were inhabitants in the country of Palestine, and there were around 700,000 Arabs who inhabited the ancient land. I think just reading his statement and his promise dismantles the same agenda, propaganda that Zionists promoted back then. So Palestinian land and life, Palestinian land and life are not worthy for those imperial leaders and the empire, British Empire and the Zionist movement. They are not worthy compared to the newcomers. And here I'm talking about the Jewish immigrants to Palestine. So we need to keep in mind that most of the Jew early settlers were European. So it came down to the idea of the superiority of Europeans, or I would say even further, the superiority of the white man. He could subdue other people. And I like what Ben White, a British journalist and very well connected with the Palestinians and have written many books about it. In his book in 2009, Israeli Apartheid, he says that for the Zionists, Palestine, and here he means Zionists as Christians and Jews as well, Palestine was empty, not literally, but in terms of people of equal worth to the incoming settlers. So you can see the weightness of that the land is empty of people who has, for the colonizers, the same worth compared to the newcomers, the settlers in Palestine. And this map just show you that between 1936 to 1940, how much the immigrants were able to build settlements on the Palestinian lands. And unfortunately, many times it's neglected that Palestinian hosted Jewish immigrants who ran away from anti-Semitism of the anti-Semitism in Europe. They ran away in Palestine and the Palestinians hosted them. And there is a powerful book written by an Israeli historian, Alan Pepe, the expulsion of Palestine, when he mentions in details how the Palestinian people assisted Jewish immigrants in settling in this land based on the Arab-Palestinian sense of responsibility to help other human beings. And at the same time, there were Jews in Palestine before the Zionist movement. There were about 33,000 Jews who carried a Palestinian citizenship, who were Palestinians before the coming of the British Empire and the Israeli Zionist movement. So in general, we could say that Palestinian Christians, due to the betrayal of the Christian West, assisting the Jews to occupy Palestine, felt that they were left behind. And here I want to quote one of the missionaries in Palestine in the 1940s, Eric Bishop, the Anglican missionary of Tiberias and Lebanon, when he wrote to his mission agency that the Palestinians feel that they have been betrayed by the Christian West. And I believe to the certain point, we still feel the same. It didn't go away. We still feel this betrayal almost every day when we see how Christians in the West are supporting the movement, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, disregard of Palestinians, supporting the Israeli army, praying for the Israeli army while cursing Palestinians. Still, Palestinian Christians feel betrayed by the Christian West, but our comfort comes from the fact that we know that other Christian communities around the world, like the Indian Dalit communities, who really sympathize with the Palestinian. So returning to that history, that the British withdrawal from Palestine in 1948 paved the way for the Jewish Zionists to claim the right to the land and establish a colonial state of Israel in 1948. 1948. Of course, we could see how this was a very short process when it was actually the British Empire consulted the United Nations, which was just a new international organization, was born after World War II, to be consulted on such a big decision about Palestine, which divided the land between Jews and Palestinians unjustly. But regardless of that, the Israeli occupation took much more than what the plan suggested. So what was a miracle for some people, and here I mean Zionist Jews from Europe, has been catastrophic. Nakba, which this is the term that we use as Palestinian in reference to 1948, the expulsion of our people from their land, and destruction of about 531 villages and towns by the Israeli Zionist militia. By the way, I always, when I talk about this, I don't differentiate between Christians and Muslims, because Christians and Muslim Palestinians suffered the Nakba equally. I remember that my grandmother, who was a teenager, she couldn't wait. Her mother, stepmother, couldn't wait for her father to return in order to escape from the attacks of the Zionist militia. So they had to take the first boat to Gaza in order to flee from the massacres that Zionist militia committed in Palestine. This is just a map that illustrates to you the loss of land between 1946 and today. Unfortunately, even for today, I don't feel this, I would say, optimism about even having these small cantons or boxes of land for Palestinians in Palestine, as Israel nowadays is aiming to annex the rest of the land in the West Bank, leaving Palestinians living in a small open prison cells like where I live in Bethlehem. We are surrounded by the wall, and Israel every single week somehow comes to decision to annex more and more lands from the West Bank. So the urgency to support religiously the colonial state of Israel didn't stop by the British Empire, but it continues actually with the new rise of the Zionist movement after 1948, and in particular, I would say after 1967, where those Christian Zionists in the West who are committed to the Zionist project saw the event of 1948 to be a fulfillment of a prophecy that God sent his people back to their land. And I think they dismiss the reality that God already fulfilled his promise to the Jewish people in 539 BC when he sent them back to the land after the collapse of the Babylonian Empire. So they talk about double fulfillment of a single prophecy, and they see that as a fulfillment of God's promises to the Jewish people. And of course, as Palestinian, I refuse such an interpretation, because in my faith, God has already been faithful to the Jewish people through even the person of Jesus Christ. First, through the return from the exile, the Babylonian exile. Second, through the fulfillment and the salvation brought to them and to all of us through the person of Jesus Christ. So supporting Israel for many of my beloved brothers and sisters, despite all of our differences, unfortunately, they are blindly and unquestionably supporting the state of Israel and supporting the Zionist ideology. And of course, we could see how the Zionist Christian ideology espoused European and American politics, and most particularly now with the rise of nationalism in the US, in Israel, and in India also, there is this mix of religion. They want to have a state that is religious or to be identified by a certain religion, like in the US, Christianity, in Palestine, Israel, they want to have it as a Judaism to be the religion of the state, or to have a Jewish state, and in India to have a Hindu state. Wants to return to Hindustan. We see this rise of nationalism supported by also religious ideology. You could see this. These are just a few examples of how preachers in the US and in the West have been connecting the blessings, the God's protection for their nations through being or doing favors to Israel. You could see John Hagee, one of the maybe the biggest leaders of the Christian Zionism in the US, who leads a church of more than 20,000 people, and his sermon every week is broadcasted internationally. He thinks that Israel is God's gateway to blessing, and the time or the day America turns its back to Israel, God will turn his back on America. As this become obsession with Israel, to the point that they think that Israel is the key for blessing or a key for curse. Their destination or destiny is has the focal point in supporting Israel. And the Israeli Zionist government recognized this very well, recognized the importance of the Christian Zionist support. And here I quote Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. He says that I don't believe that the Jewish state and modern Zionism would have been possible without Christian Zionism. We value our friends and we never forget them. And we think that you have helped establish here a powerful memorial to our friendship and our common ideals. So it's a frank recognition of Netanyahu that it's because of the support, the blind support of Christian Zionism, they were able even to sustain their presence as an occupying power, a colonial project. And here's Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States, talking before or in a conference for Christians United for Israel. At the head of it, John Hagee, that he supports Israel because he is Christian. And I question that, because you cannot support a colonial power and be a Christian at the same time. It's either way. It didn't stop by here. You know, it's our struggle as Palestinians is not only about the occupation, but also the silencing of Palestinians who want to talk about the occupation. And I'm reminded even in many countries around the world, or even when it comes to India, when Garyata Spivak wrote, "Can the subaltern speak?" And of course the subaltern could speak, but we are not allowed to speak, especially in the Western context. The European colonial or the European American Zionist Christians, and of course other religious groups, including liberals, support of Israel is leading to the silencing of Palestinian Christians. And here I'm quoting my dear friend and colleague, Munzer Isaac, who published recently his book, The Other Side of the Wall, which I highly recommend for people who would be interested in reading this book. He writes that in many Christian circles, my being a Palestinian means that I am dismissed as irrelevant, or even as a past obstacle to God's plan for the land of my forefathers. So it's not only there is the agenda to occupy the land and dismiss its people, but also to silence our voices as Palestinians who want to speak up who want to present their voice, who want to present themselves and their narrative and their case and cause, but we are being silenced, we are being disinvited from conferences, from talk shows, and many other events around the globe, because we are Palestinians, because we want to talk about Palestinian issue and Palestinian struggle for peace. So the reality of occupation is now continues in settlements, the stolen land of Palestinians. Nowadays in the West Bank, we have more than 600,000 Israeli settlers who live in Palestinian stolen lands. We're talking about separation wall, which goes around 700 kilometers long around the Palestinian West Bank and Palestinian towns and cities. Israeli military checkpoints, more than 500 checkpoints in between Palestinian cities and towns, which makes it very difficult for us as Palestinians to travel or to move commute from city to city. Israeli presence filled with Palestinians, around 5,000 to 6,000 Palestinians are now detained in Israeli presence, and some of them without just court system to deal with their legal issues, even if they have ones. And of course, we could talk about the demolition of houses, especially in Jerusalem, for example, where 28% of the Palestinians' houses are threatened of demolition by the Israeli government and the Israeli police. Also, the control of natural resources and borders. We are talking about water, space, and land, which we don't have any control over. And lastly, active and systematic racism, which of course manifested or constituted a few years ago by the nation state law, which makes it very clear that the state of Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. With complete disregard to the Palestinian who live in the state of Israel and other ethnic groups who live in Israel or religious groups who live in Israel, in which it realizes its natural, cultural, religious, and historical right to self-determination. And secondly, we see that this law gives self-determination as a unique right only to the Jewish people. So, system or the class stratification in India, where there are the Dalit, the non-touchable, and for us as Palestinians, we became the non-touchable or untouchable in this land. We became the Dalit of this land, who are not allowed to speak, who are not allowed to express their even their voices, their struggle, and they don't have the right for self-determination. So here comes the uniqueness of Kairos. As I stated earlier, Palestinian Christians went through a faith crisis because of the occupation, the misuse of the Bible to justify the occupation, the colonization of Palestine, and dismissal, dehumanization of the Palestinian people. And Kairos Palestine came to that moment of history to bring the international, global church attention and other religious groups to Palestine. Kairos, as you might know, is a Greek word which means in a point of time or a moment for decision, which comes from the New Testament in reference to the moment of God's intervention in history through the incarnation of Christ. Kairos Palestine specifically takes Kairos to mean the moment when we see God's gift in the midst of our suffering. And here what's the patriarch Michel Sabah, the only Palestinian patriarch in the Latin church history in Palestine, defines it as a moment when we see God's glory. The inspiration of Kairos Palestine comes from actually the South African document, which was published in 1985, which was a theological reflection and a word of truth against the systematic racism and apartheid in South Africa. By the way, the South African people and the South African church theologians helped so much in the work and development and the consultation that brought about the publication of Kairos Palestine, or the launching of Kairos Palestine. So as much as the South African Kairos Palestine document received attention globally, the Palestinian also did, because it came as part of a movement around the world in Central America in 1988, Zimbabwe in 1998, in India in 2001, and later in Palestine. So I think there is a significant rise of people of the South who want to speak up again. And here I'm reminded, even in the shift of in the gravity of global Christianity from the North, the control of the North to the South. And here our voices are rising up together in solidarity to talk about our struggles and the injustice that we face on a daily basis. So Kairos Palestine, when it comes to Palestine, is a Palestinian ecumenical Christian, a prophetic voice. That's what I prefer to call it. It's a prophetic voice, which became also a prophetic movement. Actually, Kairos Palestine could be the only document who has many representatives of church families and church leaders, about 16 leaders who contributed to the document from various church traditions, including, of course, 3 women were on the board of writing Kairos Palestine. But the Kairos Palestine document originated actually in Amman call in 2007, which I consider as the starting point leading to the development of Kairos Palestine. The call included commitments to furthering theological and biblical perspective and Christian education resources around those issues which are central to the conflict in Palestine, and strengthening the church's response to the occupation. In 2008, the same group who met in Amman and published Amman Call met in Bern, Switzerland, and later published or produced Bern Perspective, which called for more attention specifically to a theological and biblical understanding of the Promised Land. Here, of course, we could talk in length about the issue of Promised Land, understanding of Promised Land, and understanding of the chosenness of the Jewish people and what that means for us. But as I'm focusing on Kairos Palestine here, the Kairos Palestine was written between the 2007 and 2009 by those church leaders secretly, but at the same time was in consultation with other theologians from India, from South Africa, and other countries around the world, and it was launched in December 11, 2009 in Bethlehem. So Kairos Palestine intended to appeal to the international community to hear the Palestinian stories of suffering and to invite the global Christian community to stand against injustice and apartheid in Palestine. As I mentioned earlier, for so long the Palestinian voices were dismissed, silenced, and at that moment that Kairos Palestine is giving voice to the Palestinian people and Palestinian Christian community in particular. So Kairos Palestine is a cry out from within the suffering in our country, Palestine, under the Israeli occupation, which with a cry of hope in the absence of all hope. And as you might know, the Palestinians in 1993 signed a peace agreement, which was built on the basis of two-state solution. But since 1993 till 2009, which is 16 years, the Israelis didn't move forward with the peace agreement, and Palestinians felt hopeless. And unfortunately, until today, at some point we feel hopeless about peace, but we are still crying for hope, and we have a cry of hope, cry of prayer and faith in a God ever vigilant, in God's divine providence for all the inhabitants of this land. The aim of the document, the Kairos Palestine document, is address it's first of all to ourselves as Palestinians, and then to all churches and Christians in the world, asking them to stand against injustice, but also to stand for peace, just peace and reconciliation. And at the same time, I would say even to repent on the ongoing sin of denying the Palestinian voices and their rights in this land, and just supporting Israel and the Israeli people blindly without any being moderate even in their approach, not being even in a position to bring the Palestinians and Israelis together. The document is 12 pages long, depends on which copy you pick up, and has 10 main subheadings and points addressing the faith of the authors and the Palestinian Christians. It explains the realities of Palestinian Christians and Muslims. The document exhorts inclusion rather than exclusion, which we see in the nation-state law, in the colonial ideology of Christian Zionism and the state of Israel. It calls for peace, justice, and reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians, as all people are created equally in God's image. It frankly considers the Israeli occupation of Palestine or Palestinian land is a sin against God and humanity, because it deprives the Palestinians of their basic human right bestowed by God. It distorts the image of God in the Israeli who has become an occupier, just as it distorts this image in the Palestinian living under occupation. And please give careful attention to this statement, because as Palestinians, in our prophetic voice, we don't only speak to our people and to the church in general, but also we are speaking to the Israelis, because we are able to recognize God's image in the occupier. And what we are hoping to do in Kairos, Palestine, and as a voice for Palestinian Christians, is also to redeem the occupier from his sin, calling him to repent, to recognize the sinfulness of occupation. The Kairos Palestine document, I will just briefly present 10 points. First is the reality on the ground, the first point of the document. Everybody is talking about peace in Palestine, but actually nobody is working to achieve that peace. And that's what the document presents: the separation wall, the Israeli settlements, the daily humiliation, the refugees, the prisoners. They are all obstacles in our reality and stopping the peace process. And I would say the frozenness of the peace process is a responsibility of Israel, who denies the Palestinians all of these rights, but even continues imposing a new laws, continues its oppression in new ways on Palestinians. Second subheading, or second main point of Kairos Palestine, is a word of faith, that as Palestinian Christians we believe in God, the creator of the world, and his eternal word, and his only Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit. And for me, as Palestinian Christian, I felt the strike when I read Kairos document for the first time, that as a Palestinian Christian, I need to explain my doctrines of faith to the other churches, to the international churches, in order to understand that I'm not a heretic, just because I'm presenting my voice or my argument for Palestinian Christian. So the third point is hope. Despite the lack of peace process to get better life and reality, as Palestinian Christians, we still have hope, as a clinging into hope and better future. We believe in love, and we believe in commitment to Jesus' command that we have to love each other as he loved us, and we have also to love and fairly treat our enemies. Our fifth, our word to our brothers and sisters, as we all face a blocked way and a future that is all its promises are, and our word to our brothers and sisters in the world is a word of hope, patience, steadfastness for a better future. And in the meantime, we continue to live under God's will and his word. The sixth point that Kairos Palestine makes is our word to the churches, a calling for the churches in the world to recognize Palestinian suffering, standing in solidarity with Palestinians, and even working to help Palestinians to get their rights for self-determination and freedom. Also, the Kairos document calls the community, the international community, for action. Stop working on double standards when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian, but also see the resolution of the Palestinian struggle by having equality between all parties. Also, Kairos Palestine doesn't negate the presence of the Jewish and Muslim religious people and their role in the Palestinian-Israeli struggle, or the Palestinian suffering of occupation. That Palestinian Christians in Kairos document, they are addressing even their Jewish and Muslim religious leader, calling them to see that every human being is created by God and has given equal dignity. Also, it calls Palestinians and Israelis to see the face of God in each other as God's creatures and overcome the barriers of fear. And as Palestinians, despite all of these challenges, despite the hopelessness, we still have hope and faith that God will intervene, God will finally triumph over the evil of hate and death that still persists in our land. So I just want to repeat here that the significance of Kairos Palestine is not only a voice for people in Palestine, it's not only addressed to the international community and churches, but also it recognizes the divine image of the Israelis. It talks to the Israelis as a human being, not as enemies. It recognizes that Israelis have right to live as much as Palestinians also have right to live in peace. So Kairos Palestine as a document also called for creative resistance. The Palestinian creative resistance of Kairos became widely known around the world because the creativity of the invention of that term to call Palestinians to resist, and for other Christian groups and other people around the world to resist the occupation non-violently. Kairos Palestine doesn't believe in violence. Kairos Palestine believes in creative resistance through like boycotting, divestment, and sanctions, the BDS movement that obligates Israel to recognize the Palestinian suffering right for their land and independent state, and pressure Israel to comply to the international law. The creative resistance of Palestinians is not motivated by fear or a desire to revenge, but by love, not hostility, inclusion, not exclusion, moderation, not extremism, reconciliation, and coexistence. Kairos Palestine globally has been endorsed, and locally too has been endorsed by the Prime Minister of the Palestinian territories and PA back then in 2009, Dr. Fayyad, and of course received endorsements from many international and churches and NGOs. Nowadays, we have around 80 groups in 30 countries are actively engaged with Kairos Palestine and promoting it. Lastly, and recently, we published Cry for Hope, Cry of Hope, which joins with the movement, which is part of Kairos Palestine, which joins the movements of oppressed people around the world in taking a stand against the politics and economics of empire, a global order of domination manifesting in racial, economic, culture, and environmental oppression that threatens humanity and all of creation. It calls on churches, ecumenical organizations, concerned advocates from other faith traditions, and that's the most important part of it, because Kairos Palestine also had received responses from Muslims in South Africa and Muslims in Gaza who wrote a response to Kairos, and partners from all sectors of civil society undertake these 7 action. And I will conclude my presentation about Kairos and the global movement of Kairos with the 7 action that we would like for our partners in advocacy in work to be mindful of. First, to initiate a process at local, wherever you are, local, denominational or ecumenical level that leads to a decisive action regarding the denial of the Palestinian right. We are also calling our partners to confront theologies and understanding of the Bible that justifies the oppression of the Palestinian people, to support Palestinian resistance, including boycotting, divestment, and sanctions, and direct political advocacy. We demand that the governments, and that's what all of us could do, and on local level or even on a national level, calling our governments and world bodies employ politics, diplomatic, and economic means to stop the Israeli violation of human rights and international law, support initiatives between Israeli and Palestinians, an interfaith partnership that oppose apartheid and create opportunity to work together for justice and equality. And lastly, we call people not only to hear about our stories and read, but to come and see. And I appreciate that some of you have been already to Palestine many times. They came and saw, so we invite other people to come and see the reality in the Holy Land, to stand in solidarity with the grassroots initiatives for a just peace. Consider this a personal invitation for each one of you to participate in our cry of hope, to join our Kairos movement, Global Kairos for Justice. Actually, you could Google Cry of Hope, and you could sign our petition so the voices of Palestinians could be heard. Thank you so much for allowing me to take your time and present the story of Palestinian people, and welcoming any questions from you.
Thank you, Yousef, for that presentation. You started out with the history of the Palestinians and how Zionist movement started distorting that history. Colonial West again cheated the Palestinians, and thereon the struggle has been of how the land was occupied And in 1948 came the problem, the great disaster, the Nakba, the catastrophe. And from there on, the suffering that Palestinians have had to undergo, the humiliation, the denial of human rights, and the West continuing with their Zionist theological outlook to put the Palestinians out of the picture. And today's world also, as we see what Trump has been doing with UAE and Bahrain and other countries, trying to belittle the Palestinian cause. So it's a real cry, and you have ended up very beautifully that the Kairos Palestine movement has now come up with this new document, Cry for Hope. Our friends are here, and in the chat box, I've seen a lot of comments and possible questions coming up. So I now leave it open to our friends to come up with their questions or comments that they would like to make. The time is yours.
Well, my observation, it's very good presentation, excellent history, excellent insights. I thought that actually when I began listening to his introduction as a professor, as a theologian, end of his talk, end of his presentation, I look at him as a human rights activist, a God personified person who has presented your whole biblical perspective that you've given. So first of all, my thanks, my gratitude. My question to him is how we as a group, he has given very good points for us, and also the similarities that he has shown with India, our own discriminatory factors with regard to, especially he has compared with Dalit reality and context. And again, he goes on with South Africa. I like, first of all, I would like to see the ways how we could be a call for hope. What I look at him, because he's giving us a way forward also, demanding with the government support for Palestine, confronting our own biblical, our own theology perspective, and how we oppose our very mindset, what is happening at global level. So my question to him is, first of all, my congratulations, and my question is, as we are all not directly, we haven't have been involved in this issue, but how we as a lobbying group, I'm talking on behalf of me and our group, we are struggling, how we could be a linkage, a bridge between them, between his group, and constantly, we could have this sort of exchange, and whereby, what we can do from his perspective, as from India, meeting, as he's talking of diplomacy affecting the government. So I would like to get, from advocacy point of view, what would be his suggestion to us as a forum.
So thank you so much for your words, and
sister,
of course,
sister Anastasia, an advocate.
Yeah, Asad. And I really appreciate how you brought this up. I think there is so much in common, as I mentioned, between India and Palestine. And I think what we need is really bridging Palestinians and Indians when it comes even to the Dalit community, because there is so much of our experience relates to the Dalit community in India, and through our shared experiences, we could speak up. What I like to point out for the advocacy, nowadays we are focusing on the cry of hope with the main points that I delivered as a starting point for rising or working on advocacy with the Palestinian people. So I would highly recommend if you could go check out our Cry of Hope. And I believe that Ranjan and Roger they have links for that they could share resources with you. And taking the cry of hope of Palestinians as a starting point to share with other people and to work on advocacy for Palestinians and with Palestinians.
Thank you.
Yousef, unfortunately, Roger, our moderator, has been signed out.
Okay.
So I'll take over from him, but please ask your questions. Try and make your questions very short so that Yousef is able to address many questions. And Yousef, if you also have looked at the chat room, you will find many things are just affirmations of what you said. You know, words of support, words of solidarity. But in addition, please ask questions.
Actually,
Just
I will
unmute yourself. Yes, sorry. Yes, Yousef.
I will share with everyone here the website of Cry for Hope. So you could check it out. You could read the document, our letter, and actually you could sign it too. So I would really appreciate if you could do that.
Yeah.
Yes. Questions?
Questions?
Yes, yes, Stian.
Unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself, Stian, please. Unmute yourself.
Yeah. Just
Stian, yeah.
Okay, as a foreigner to India, thank you for the opportunity to share this and to listen to Yousef again. Yousef, I always enjoy your presentations and your thoughts. Just two things. One is just a comment that what you were talking about and sharing with us about the Palestine Kairos document. I want to assure you, even in this context, that the Palestine Kairos document is infinitely more powerful than the South African Kairos document in terms of its message and so on. I just want to affirm this as a person who has also been involved in the South African Kairos document. We never had the courage to talk about love. And love also, you know, in all the different ways, including that about, as you shared with us, also the oppressor. It's unfathomable in many ways, as we all know. Okay. Then I just want to ask you, you know, the issue of Christian support for Israel and for Zionism, if you wouldn't mind comment on this as well, is not only related to a specific doctrine and theology of Christian Zionism. So many Christians, even just by default, are in support of Israel. You know, that's just how we are, and not necessarily even using the Bible. But then there are others who know the situation and remain silent, or sort of by night support. And others who make critical statements but do nothing. So the issue of Christian support for Zionism and Israel is so much broader, and I hope that part of the discussion could also start growing amongst ourselves in our churches and our communities, etc. How we are also complicit in this, although we may not be Christian Zionist in the sort of doctrinal sense of the word. I hope these comments are clear.
Thank you, Stian. I value your input in that, and definitely we always have to understand that Christian Zionism is not a sit on my. It's only something about Christian doctrine or theology. Even the most liberal Christians who doesn't really commit to orthodoxy still committed to Israel and the Zionist project. It seems that people are afraid who are complicit with the occupation or silent. They are afraid of being accused of anti-Semitism, or are afraid of losing the blessings of God from just not supporting Israel or criticizing Israel. Even most notably, we are talking about Christian Zionism, but nowadays we are suffering and we are seeing the rise of Islamic Zionism too. So we were talking about Christian Zionism for long, and nowadays it's time also to talk about how Christian and Islamic Zionism are working together and supporting Israel, not based on certain doctrines, either in Islam or Christianity, but just in a political, ideological interest for both groups.
Roger, can I ask a question, please?
Please, please.
Yousef, I know that the Christian population in Palestine has been slowly decreasing. Could you tell us how many Christians there are now who have not, left just because they cannot live there any longer?
Yeah, I appreciate that you brought this up. It's one of the points that Kairos Palestine mentions is the issue of immigration. Many Palestinian Christians left the country because of the political and economic struggle. In the recent study, there is about less than 1% of the population is a Christian. We're talking about 46,000 Christian lives in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, compared to 17% in the before the Israeli occupation and after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. In addition to that, which is sadly, it's a sad thing to say, is a recent study done in Palestine about 36 to 39% of Palestinian Christians who would immigrate if they get a chance to do so. And about 50% of Palestinian Christians in Gaza also are willing to immigrate if they have the chance to do so. So that's why Kairos Palestine comes to the fore as a call for hope and of hope in a time of hopelessness. That's we believe, as Michel Sabah, the Latin patriarch, former Latin patriarch, once said that we are getting to the point of impossible. The point of impossible, that there is no way to return. There is no way that Palestinian Christians would increase or stay in this land, because it seems that there is no hope for a better future.
Laila wants to speak.
Yeah, thanks, Ranjan. Thank you so much, Yousef. Every time I hear a Palestinian, it's not a presentation, but where you share it so powerfully and so beautifully. I thank you for that. I'm really interested in creative resistance movement and cry for hope and cry of hope that's now being sort of in motion, I think, from what I hear. I'd like to know how that's being done, because I think creative resistance is one way of breaking barriers, boundaries, religions, caste, and getting as many people on board. Especially, I think clock is really ticking, because you talked about voices being suppressed. We're facing the same here as well. The voice of dissent is suppressed, and all of us have to speak up now. So I just wanted to know how creative resistance movement as of now, and how many more can join in together with the Palestinians.
Thank you. I think something very significant that Kairos Palestine contributed is the idea of creative resistance, not believing that violence could, believing that violence would bring violence, So creative resistance of Palestinians comes through boycotting the Israeli products, the Israeli, even sometimes academia who ignores Palestinians or complicit with occupation. We ask companies who are, and churches actually, they have investments in Israel. The Anglican Church, the Presbyterian Church, and back in the history, they had investments in Israeli companies to withdraw their investments. I believe this way of isolating Israel in order not to endanger the presence of Israel or the livelihood of Israelis, but in order for the Israelis to recognize the rights of Palestinians, pushing them to recognize the rights of Palestinians. The creative resistance of Palestinians have also been working in a way of dialoguing with other Israelis who are willing to talk and want to talk about peace, who are willing to sit on a table as equal partners in the dialogue about peace in Palestine, Israel. So I believe as people who are interested in standing, advocating for the rights of Palestinians, is to check what churches do have investments in Israel, especially, believe me, before the time of COVID-19, many Indian groups who come to Palestine, and you see, for example, many of the Pentecostal church, for example, in India, and you have from the Orthodox Church of India, who stay in certain in the Israeli territories, you know, who don't come to Palestine and see Palestinians, you know, in a way that they are supporting Israeli companies who are very supportive of the Israeli army and the occupation, and neglecting the Palestinian companies and the Palestinian people who work in the Palestinian territory. So I believe that you could do something where you are in India. Just check where churches are sending their people, what the people are seeing in Palestine, the investments that's been happening. Unfortunately, on a national or governmental level in India, and that's, you know, I could understand it because of the rise of nationalism and this connection between Israel and India. There is a military collaboration between the Israelis and Indians, but I believe that people on the ground also have voice and have a role to play in bringing or giving us as Palestinian voice in your society, and doing something in order to make Israel work for peace and justice on Palestinians.
Yousef, can you also tell us about some of the creative art forms of resistance that Palestinians themselves are into? I mean, the whole separation wall is also a resistance wall. Can you tell us something about art and culture, which is a very big part of Palestinian resistance?
I think art is part of resistance, right? Every resistance has the creative aspect of it, where people could vent, could present their stories. And what Israel meant to be a wall, an ugly wall that separates people, I see that Palestinians' art is trying to draw a hole in that wall in order to stretch a hand of peace for the Israeli neighbors. The ways that you see that this wall becoming, instead of a symbol of hatred and division, which it is, but I think it's becoming for Palestinian a place where we could tell our story, show that we are people worthy of life, worthy of being recognized, respecting our dignity, our humanity, and not only through the arts of drawing in Palestine, but also maintaining our heritage of dances and songs as our theology that we write. And I really appreciate how many Palestinian theologians remind through their work, creative contextualization of the Bible, to see that our present theology is an outcome of centuries of theology being developed in Palestine. And I wish something here, which is that many of you could come and see the wall, come and tour around the wall to see that how actually the walls between humans that God intended to tear down, fear of others, bring it up again. But as Palestinians, I would like to tell you that we are not afraid of our Jewish neighbors. We are not afraid of them. We have given a lot of sacrifices in the past. You could imagine that as Palestinians in 1948, when we lost about 78% of our land. In 1993, we said, okay, we would take the 22% of the land and we would respect the Israeli right to live peacefully in a part of our land. So we did the compromise, we did the sacrifice as Palestinians in order for both groups to live together peacefully.
Well, friends, we've had a good time together. I will ask Sister Zita to say a few words and to conclude this webinar.
On behalf of all the members of the newly formed Indo-Palestine Solidarity Network, it's my privilege to give a vote of thanks today. First of all, I would like to thank our main speaker, Yousef Alkhouri. Yousef, we are so grateful that you accepted our invitation to speak to us on the topic, Understanding Palestine, the Kairos document, and the global Kairos movement. For me, as for many others, our understanding and knowledge of the global Kairos movement was quite minimal. But your fine exposition has increased our understanding 100-fold. Thank you very much. Your own academic credentials, coupled with your ground experience as a member of different organizations working for justice, for Palestine, and for interfaith dialogue, adds to the reality of what you have shared. We were very happy to get such a wonderful background history of Palestine, of religion justifying the occupation, of Zionism, and the actual reality of what's happening in Palestine as well, the silencing of the Palestinians in so many different ways. Your talk about Kairos Palestine was excellent, and it has given us a good understanding of what the document is about. The moment of truth, I thought, was very good. Occupation, and when you mentioned occupation as a sin against God and humanity, it is something that we all need to take seriously. Also, the word of faith, hope, and love. I think that is what is something that will move us forward. The cry of hope that you spoke about, and which we have also rewritten for our own IPSN, since we are a secular group and not just a Christian group. That cry of hope is something that will call us forward. And the program that you showed for the way forward is something that is really admirable. We have talked a lot about creative resistance through nonviolence, and that's motivated by love, solidarity, and hospitality. Thank you very much, Yousef. I want to say a special word of thanks to all the members of IPSN who have attended this Zoom meeting. And also thank you to all the other participants who have shown enough of interest in the cause of Palestine to give up their time for this meeting. We are still a young organization, and we will welcome others who are interested in becoming a part of the IPSN and are happy to make a commitment to it. If you are really interested in joining, give us your name and email ID on the chat box. We have recently started a Facebook page which updates its readers on what is happening in Palestine, and we hope to open a Twitter account soon. In conclusion, let us remember the gift of freedom which we all prize. This gift has been denied to the Palestinians, and at this time when Palestinians are feeling so betrayed by those whom they consider their allies, we remember what Nelson Mandela said. We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. Thank you, Yousef, and thanks to all the participants and to all those who organized this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, friends, and thank you, Yousef. Once again, you have stirred us to be proactive for the Palestinian concerns through creative resistance. Thanks to each one who has participated. Have a good evening and a stirring night for commitment to the future. Thank you.
Thank you.